On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Bob Weber from Kansas State University, and I'd like to welcome you to the module entitled Multiple Trait Selection and Economic Selection Indices. I'm Matt Spangler, and I will be the presenter for this module. I'm a professor of animal genetics and extension beef genetics specialist at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I hold a PhD in animal breeding and genetics from the University of Georgia, and I've had the opportunity to work with the genetic evaluation of over 20 different beef breed organizations. As a general overview of this module, we'll discuss in detail economically relevant traits, and we'll talk about methods of multiple trait selection, including tandem selection, independent culling levels, and economic selection indices. And we'll also talk about the selection indices that are offered by numerous U.S. beef breed associations. What impacts profit? There are a lot of components, obviously, that impact profitability at the commercial cow-calf level. Depending on somebody's particular objectives, profitability could be impacted by fertility of the cow herd, growth of the corresponding calves, carcass merit of the calves, and the overall labor required that's dedicated to the cow herd. Each component has a different marginal impact on profitability, and that impact is dependent on breeder-specific goals. If the breeder has a terminal objective whereby all calves born are destined for harvest, then it is things like growth and potentially carcass merit that impact profitability. Whereas if somebody retains replacement females, but also sells calves either at weaning or at some point later, then it is a mixture of traits related to terminal objectives and maternal objectives that impact profitability. And each segment of the industry puts emphasis on different suites of traits depending on what traits impact their revenue and costs. So for terminal sires, I could rationalize that the traits of importance include calf survival, male fertility, disease susceptibility, calving ease direct, how easily his calves will be born when he is bred to heifers, growth rate, the efficiency of feed utilization, and carcass quality and composition. I've highlighted traits in blue for which EPD are readily available across the majority of beef breed associations, traits in black which either there are some indicators for or the EPDs published by some breed association, but maybe there are several organizations which don't publish an EPD for it. And then the ones in red, which we don't have a direct EPD for. Contrast the list of traits important for terminal sires compared to those that are important for maternal characteristics such as female fertility, maternal calving ease, how easily a bull's daughters will give birth during their first parturition. Maintenance energy requirements, largely driven by differences in weight at maturity. Reproductive longevity. Maternal weaning weight, which we name that EPD milk, and I would also highlight that it has a maintenance component to it as well. Disease susceptibility again, regional adaptation, and temperament. So for producers wishing to enhance more than one trait simultaneously, as I believe nearly all beef cattle producers would wish to, they are forced to find a system to enable them to do that. And I've listed here the three ways that can be done. One is what we call tandem selection. In tandem selection, if we assume two traits, we might select on the first trait until we reach the desired level, and then we ignore that trait and begin selection on the second trait. The problem with tandem selection is it is inefficient, and it is possible that selection for the second trait could erode progress made in the first trait if they happen to be antagonistically related. An example, maybe the first trait is calving ease and the second trait is post-weaning growth. Obviously, birth weight is an indicator of calving ease. Birth weight and post-weaning growth are genetically correlated, and so it's possible as I select for animals that are larger post-weaning, I could inadvertently erode some of the progress I made in calving ease. Independent culling levels. Independent culling levels assume that I set thresholds. They could be arbitrary thresholds, whereby animals have to meet or exceed each one of them before I consider them as a potential candidate for selection. The problem is that not all traits are created equal economically, and independent culling levels ignore that. And then there's also selection indices, which we'll discuss in further detail. The problem is that independent culling levels are cumbersome. It requires the producer to come up with those thresholds. They are inefficient at generating response to selection. And as I mentioned before, the thresholds generally are not economically based. And they assume that each trait is weighted equally when in fact they may not be. Selection indexes, on the other hand, are objective and easy to use and interpret. They are economically driven, and the relative economic values, or REVs, arise through either bioeconomic simulation or a combination of that and partial budgeting approaches. And they allow a linkage between economically relevant traits and indicator traits. Here I have an example of independent culling levels where we assume we set thresholds of calving ease direct, weaning weight, stayability, and marbling. So for a bull to be a selection candidate for us, he has to meet or exceed the threshold for each one of these traits. I have an example here of 4 different bulls and their EPDs for those 4 traits along with their economic index value. You'll note that bull number 4 I have highlighted in red. His calving ease direct EPD is below our threshold. And remember, a higher number for calving ease direct is generally considered better. So if we strictly adhere to our calving ease EPD threshold, we would not consider bull 4. However, he happens to be superior for weaning weight, stayability, and marbling, and as a consequence, his index value is also the highest. So although he barely missed the threshold for one trait, he is still superior, and that's because the index weights the traits based on their relative economic importance and thus allows superiority in some traits to offset perhaps somewhat poorer genetic potential for others. So what is a selection index? You can think of it as selection on aggregate merit as first defined by Hazel in his landmark paper in 1943. And it's a list of traits that influence satisfaction, which we've come to think of as influencing net profit at the commercial cow-calf level. The relative economic values for each trait then are associated with changes in that satisfaction, holding all other traits constant. In other words, if I increase one trait by 1 unit and hold all other traits constant, what is the impact in terms of net profit? It really is a list of characteristics to be measured on an individual, and the relationships between those characteristics and the genetics or the genotypes. And so here I have an expression of an index H, which is comprised of these A's, which are the weighting of the breeding values or of the EPDs. And so it's a sum of the genetic merit estimates, the breeding values of the EPDs, weighted proportional to their economic importance. So why do we need selection indexes? I'm a fan of this quote from Rick Borden in the late 1990s that said, "There is no easily accessible objective way for breeders, particularly breeders in the beef and sheep industries where ownership is diverse and production environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently." And by these predictions, he was referring to EPD. There are a lot of EPD, and the production environment and production goals differ substantially from producer to producer. And economic selection indices offer a means to make the selection process simpler. So this slide represents how to connect the selection index and the breeding goals. The traits in the selection index are those which we have EPD for. The traits in the breeding goal or the breeding objective are the things that we wish to improve because they are directly related to profitability. So here we have traits in our index that are calving ease, weaning weight, yearling weight, milk, heifer pregnancy, and stayability. And those are related to the things that impact our profit, like calf survival, weaning weight, female fertility and longevity, and feed intake. We do not need to have an EPD for everything in our breeding objective. But the things in the index need to be genetically correlated to the things we wish to change in the objective. This shows genetic correlations between mature cow weight, MW, and earlier in life growth traits such as birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight. And mature cow weight is genetically correlated, at least at a moderate level, to the rest of these growth traits. As a consequence, if my sale point of calves is at weaning and I retain replacement heifers, then as I select to increase weaning weight, there is a chance there will be a correlated response in mature cow size, such that cows will become larger and presumably require more feed over time. And so this pits revenue, the sale of weaning weight, against cost, which is maintenance costs of the cow herd. The use of a well-formed selection index helps us optimize those decisions such that we continually select in a direction that leads to more net profit. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all economic indexes that are offered by U.S. beef breed organizations. However, it does show many of them. Here I've delineated them as either being terminal in nature or general purpose. The indexes delineated as being terminal assume that all calves born are destined to be harvested. No replacement females are retained. As a consequence, these indices put greater emphasis on post-weaning performance, including growth and carcass merit. The general purpose indices, however, assume that replacement females will be retained, and as a consequence there is emphasis on traits that directly impact the cow herd, such as fertility or mature cow size. In addition, they contain traits related to revenue at the point of sale, be that through the feeding sector, through the feed yard, or at weaning. It's important to utilize an index that best matches your breeding objectives. So, if you intend to retain replacement females, it would be inappropriate to use an index that is strictly terminal in nature. Doing so would ignore fertility and would put emphasis only on post-weaning traits such as growth, which could have unintended consequences in terms of increasing the size of cows and thus the feed intakes required for the cow herd. Here's an example of putting an index to work in practice. The differences in index values are a measure of net profitability per exposure. And here, this example is using the Red Angus Herd Builder Index. I have two bulls, Bull A and Bull B. The difference in their index values is 24. If I make the assumption that each bull will be exposed to 30 cows per year over a 4-year time horizon, that's 120 exposures. If I multiply the number of exposures by the difference in their index values, I arrive at approximately $2,900 difference between the two bulls in terms of net profit, assuming that my breeding objective aligns with the assumptions of the index. This allows me to gauge what the proper investment is in terms of either purchasing Bull A compared to Bull B, or perhaps the unit cost of semen between the two bulls. So not only can I rank the bulls based on their genetic differences in net profit potential, but I can also follow the arithmetic here to gain a sense for which one might be the wiser investment at different price points. And purchasing bulls or purchasing semen, no doubt, is an investment. And producers often face the problem of obtaining the best bulls for their operation given their particular setting. And as a consequence, best is a relative concept. In fact, a less desirable bull may become the preferred choice over a more desirable bull if his sale price discount is larger than the differential in value between the two bulls. In example, if we look at the previous slide, if the less desirable bull, in that case Bull B, actually sold for $5,000 less than Bull A, he may have been the better buy. So it's important to think about bull selection not only in terms of their genetic potential, but also their genetic potential in relationship to their cost. The benefit of indexes is they enable going from tools or the EPDs to helping make decisions. So there are means of combining multiple EPDs together in an economic framework to help producers select the best bull for them as they try to increase net profit at the ranch or farm level. In summary, economic selection indexes help alleviate the cumbersome process of selecting for multiple traits simultaneously. But it's important to use indexes that best match your breeding objective. And as a consequence, not to use terminal indexes if indeed you intend on retaining replacement heifers. And always think of bull or semen purchases as the investment that they are. For continued learning, I would encourage you to watch the next module entitled Genetic Risk Management. And for concepts related to multiple trait selection, I'd refer you to Module 2 that discusses fundamental concepts of EPDs, or Module 4 which goes through trait definitions of EPDs offered by U.S. beef cattle breed organizations. And for more information related to USLGE, I'd encourage you to visit their website. Thank you again for watching this module.